Welcome to Building the Basics, where we walk you through the whys, whats, and hows of gun ownership.
On this episode today, we have a couple guests, actually, so this is going to be a fun one. So we're introducing our third co-host, Tim, and then our special guest for the evening is Ashley Hlebinsky. So Tim, we'll introduce you first. Take it over.
Hi, I'm Tim. I'm a lifetime civilian, perpetual student, a little bit of a collector, a little bit of a competitor, a little bit of a jack of all trades when it comes to guns. I get to be, do a little bit of everything, be a little bit of a mad scientist, and, learn a thing or two about guns. And, I really enjoy sharing that with people.
Nice. Thanks, Tim.
Lifetime civilian.
Lifetime civilian, yeah.
People usually think I'm military.
I think me too.
So Ashley, let's hear about, what are you bringing to the table tonight? I'm really excited to have this conversation. So yeah, let's hear what you got.
Oh gosh, what am I bringing to the table? That is a loaded question. You see what I did there?
Loaded. Nice.
For those of you guys who don't know me, I am a firearms historian, and that means a lot of different things, but my background specifically is with what we call material culture, which is the study of the objects themselves, so the firearms themselves, although I've worked with kind of all weaponry, so early crossbows, longbows, edged weapons to some extent, although that's its own really, really nuanced collecting conversation. But I started my career at the Smithsonian in their National Firearms Collection. I studied firearms in college and grad school. You have to get creative if you want to do that because there's no majors for that, although I am trying to fix that as we speak. Yeah, but I took a lot of independent studies. I studied military history. I taught the weapons portion of a military history survey course. And then I randomly studied, though, leftist firearms activism and firearms and feminism in the 1960s and 70s as it pertained to, guns and popular presses and
that's a very interesting set of words that I didn't think I would
Don't
hear.
ever think of them together, but a very, very fascinating history. So I studied all over the place. Because ultimately, I've spent a lot of time in what I call encyclopedic collections. So I was at the Smithsonian's collection, which is about 7,000 firearms. I was at the Cody Firearms Museum. I ran that for 10 years, and that's about the same number of firearms and about 30,000 related artifacts. And then I've worked with a bunch of other clients and different institutions that have these huge collections. So I like to tell people I know a little bit about a lot because you have to be able to track trends, changes in technology, changes in society. There are areas that I do specialize in and be super random stuff. We can talk about that later.
Sure.
But I kind of have this broad knowledge of history that I then have to kind of digest and dissect for the public, which is
exactly what
my
we're
background.
trying to do.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thanks for that introduction. And we'll get into all the how do we reach you? How do our listeners reach you later, and how do they follow you and all that? Let's talk a little bit. You were mentioning, you have several museums. So what do you have for historical versus modern firearms? That's very different, as the evolution of firearms has happened. So talk to us a little bit of what does that mean?
Oh, gosh. So Cody, I'll use Cody as an example. If you're not familiar, the Cody Firearms Museum is the only accredited firearms museum in the United States, which is an American Alliance of Museums. It's a super strict kind of standard that museums have to adhere to, and we're the only ones that have that. We're pretty proud about that.
That's cool.
I always say we, but I don't work there anymore, but I was there for a decade.
It's your
So I
baby.
feel I rebuilt the museum. We did a renovation. But Cody, a lot of people associate Cody as a Western firearms museum, and that's because it got its start as the Winchester Museum. It's also a part of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, so it doesn't get much more Western than that.
Wow.
But Winchester was the first major gun collection there. And so Winchester, which was Olin Foundation, they loaned the collection in 1975. They gifted it in 88. So a lot of people have this association that Cody's all Western firearms, and that could not be further from the truth. Actually, the earliest artifact in the collection, which is a hand cannon from 1475, that's from the Winchester collection.
Oh, wow.
So, and then they collected their own stuff, but then they had a guy named Edwin Pugsley. I don't want to get too in the weeds, but there's this dude. He was an executive at Winchester, and he had a huge collection and 2,000 firearms, and ended up becoming a part of that.
Goodness gracious.
So Winchester, it's kind of a misnomer when you hear that, because they collected all the way up through the 1970s before things came over to the collection. And so Cody goes from, I want to say a crossbow, oh gosh, like I think a longbow from like 300 BC. I mean, it's old stuff. And then it goes all the way up through, right when I left, we got our first 3D printed guns
No kidding.
in the museum. So
Oh, cool.
it's kind of neat because, you get literally everything. But one of the things I like to talk about when it comes to historical firearms versus modern firearms that I think people don't realize is that a lot of technologies that we associate as modern are actually really, really old. So magazine-fed firearms have been around since the 1600s. Repeating firearms have been around since as soon as firearms were developed, 1400s. I think the first 10-round repeating firearm was maybe, I think, 1490. You had your first self-rotating revolver, and if I'm saying words that you need me to define, let me know. But first self-rotating revolver, I want to say around 1680. So all these technologies that you associate as modern actually have deeply historic roots, which is actually very important to the modern gun debate. But that's kind of what I always find really interesting is people think that they've completely reinvented the wheel, but they really haven't.
They just have had
in a
the
really
wheel.
long time. Yeah, they've just made it better and break less. Well, at least that's the goal, right?
So I think something that our listeners probably don't know is repeating. So
Okay.
So talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, repeating firearms. There's actually two types of kind of multi-shot firearms. So I use the word multi-shot, and that can mean a repeating firearm, which means that the gun fires multiple rounds before having to reload. Now, there's a massive subcategory in that. So when I say repeating and multiple rounds, I'm not talking about whether it's a revolver or a semi-automatic handgun or any of that. Just the fact that it can, you can load multiple rounds of ammunition and then you can fire them one at a time.
Okay.
Whereas the reason I use multi-shot is what people don't know is that back in the 1700s, 1600s, they had volley guns where they would fire all at once. So it still had
Gotcha.
you could have the same number of rounds, but they were going off all at once.
Gotcha.
Don't recommend that. That's not super fun to shoot. I got to shoot
I was
one.
gonna say, did
yeah,
you- yeah.
I have shot a replica knock volley gun, but we didn't have any actual projectiles in it. We were shooting off a pirate ship in San Diego with the actor Rob Riggle,
Oh,
and so
okay.
we were just shooting paper
Sure.
that
Yeah.
dissolved in the water.
So Tim, I know that you have a love of history when it comes to firearms. So do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so I mean, my background in history is funny enough. It didn't come from firearms initially. It actually came from, I got into history through my corporate background. One of the things that I did is I actually traveled the country teaching chocolate history. So I'd actually
that's
travel
awesome.
from museum to museum, historical sites, and boy, did I feel like a fraud sometimes. Having conversations with actual historians about, it was somebody else's research, but I worked very closely with that person. Had a lot of experience just from that, having spent some time down in Brazil, actually farming cocoa. So I could speak to a lot of that from an experiential standpoint, but from an actual historical and research, I didn't really have so much. So funny enough, about 5 years out of undergrad, I actually started looking into, going back to school for history. And luckily I never did it.
Yeah, it's rough.
Yeah, I ended up like 2 classes in. I'm like, no, not for me, but still very much interested in it. But during that time, a lot of the chocolate history in the U.S. really revolves around, Revolutionary War era. So, any time I'm at a historic site on a break, if there's a flintlock on the wall, if there's a Pennsylvania rifle on the wall, I'm usually overstaring at
it's
that.
American long rifle. It's American long rifle.
Yeah.
And then you can break it down based on where they're at.
Yeah, I spent some time in central Pennsylvania where they were very adamant that, it was a Pennsylvania rifle. So I got hit a few times for that
Yeah.
one.
If you just say American long rifle, you're safe.
Fair enough.
So what's interesting about that, actually, as a random comment, Cody had chocolate in the collection. It actually melted one year when our HVAC wasn't working. So I guess maybe they used to have chocolate in the collection. But it was these people that were engravers. They had chocolate engravings. But what you say is interesting, because a lot of people don't realize nowadays, because firearms seem like this kind of separated, segregated thing. We've got gun culture and it's over here, and then you've got quote unquote mainstream culture. But what you see if you know firearms history, and I'm sure there's connections to everything with chocolate history, you see with firearms history that it's integral to understanding society forever. But that kind of part of the history gets lost. So Henry Ford went to Winchester in 1909 before he built the Highland Park factory. There's all Louisville Slugger, made M1 carbine stocks. But it's one of those things that people don't realize how interconnected different topics are, different histories are. Because I end up working for a lot of museums that aren't firearms museums, just because firearms are it's a gateway, a gateway for people to learn about industry and, decorative art and you name it, and I can somehow tie it back to guns. And that's kind of how you end up getting really interesting conversations. Although I don't know, I'm sure there's good chocolate gun fusion history out there that I'm not aware of.
Not that I can really think of, but
for a second after you said it, I was like, that's awesome. But then you kept talking and I was like, wait, he said chocolate, right? I thought I had a stroke for a second. Thought you were saying some big word that I didn't know.
Yeah, it's one of those things that doesn't really make sense, but it's just another very narrow niche that we can go down. I mean, you branch off into food history and all this other stuff, but working the corporate world, I had a very narrow area of expertise, and it just happened to be chocolate.
Well, what's interesting about that too, you mentioned kind of a niche specialty, and obviously gun collecting is something that gets, you've got people who are very interested in a specific topic that they study and they know, completely, but they might not know any bigger context. So you have this balance between historians are there for more context, and a lot of times collectors are there for more of the stampings and the markings and everything. And it's this interesting marriage. Well, it should be a marriage between the two, but most historians don't want to talk to collectors and vice versa. And I have lots of thoughts on that. But it is, you have to have kind of both. It's the building blocks and then connecting the dots. Mm-hmm. I feel like that made me sound really smart.
Hey. Sounds smart to me. Yeah. Marvin, what do you have? Do you have any thoughts or questions specifically right now?
No, I'm just here for the ride. I've seen a lot of people with a lot of phenomenal collections. The closest thing that I ever had was I had a Polytech AK from the 80s, and they only brought so many of those in, and then I was afraid to shoot it, so I ended up getting rid of it because I'm like, this deserves to go to somebody who can actually appreciate it instead of just keep it in a box all the time. And so that's as close as I ever got. But it's always interested me, but the fragility, the potential fragility of it, my fear of destroying something that belongs to history has always kind of overshadowed my desire to actually get deeper into it.
Yeah, and that's that whole conversation of whether or not you shoot your collection. There's a lot of differing opinions. Museums obviously don't. Although royal art, and some of the things, people talk about, firearms are really durable in terms of artifacts. It's not porcelain. So they do last for a really long time. But one of the things I always had to explain to collectors that came in was, we're trying to preserve it forever. Right. And, it does degrade over time. The Cody guns had a lot of kind of issues. They were on display for 30 years and nobody took them off display. So it was a little questionable when we got some of them off display. But then there are people that want to have a functioning collection. And Royal Armories in the UK and Leeds actually bridges that gap. A lot of the guns that come in, they fire and they video the firing process and everything, and then they accession it into the collection.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that they can prove how it works, show
yeah.
it.
So that
and
there's
then-
a historical record. So if that gun's
Right.
ever not operable, because some museums, I'm not a huge fan of this. Royal Armories obviously doesn't do this because they're Royal Armories, but some museums do try to quote unquote deactivate their firearms, which I don't recommend. There was actually a policy in Australia, I think Australia or New Zealand, like a long time ago, and a bunch of the U.S. curators and European curators, we wrote a letter to the government because it was basically the way it was written was you were going to have to destroy the functionality of all the firearms in the collection, and it's a technical collection. So yes, there are human stories, there are interesting stories that can be told with guns, but like they're also used for research so that we can forward technology. And if you can't get the inner workings of it to work, what's really the point?
It's
and you wouldn't
pointless.
do that, like, right? You wouldn't pull off a piece of inlay from a pot. But people don't see it that way with guns necessarily.
What do they do to deactivate them generally? I mean, are they like filling the bores with lead, or are they doing something more horrific?
Honestly, there is no standard. That's part of the problem. There's like this whole weird conversation like, oh, you can have that unregistered, NFA item, which I bet you're going to ask me to explain what that is. If you just deactivate it. Well, there's not a definition, although there might be, there hasn't been a consistent definition for what that means. A lot of museums, quote unquote, deactivate the firearm by removing the firing pin, which does not render it inoperable. It just, you can't fire it when the firing pin's out. I think like National Park Service, if their stuff's not on display, then the firing pin is removed from the guns. The Smithsonian did it a long time ago. They pulled all the firing pins off their guns, and then they realized that was really stupid. I want to say like in the 80s, and they started literally like putting the firing pins back on the guns because it's really hard because like in a museum, like you have to mark every part that's not attached. So like now you have 7,000, you have 7,000 firearms, and you have 7,000 firing pins, like it was just a pain in the butt. When it's not, doesn't make it necessarily like, as long as your security is fine in the museum, it doesn't necessarily make it more safe. And you run the risk of damaging the gun, putting the firing pin back in if it's a gun that's never been fired before, if it's an incredibly embellished gun. It's just, you wouldn't do that to any other artifact, so you shouldn't do it to firearms.
It kind of stinks how guns are treated.
Yeah. It was difficult for a while to transport firearms. Like you'd like transport fine art like on a loan to a museum. A lot of fine art like transporters, for lack of better words, they wouldn't take them. They wouldn't take firearms.
Interesting.
Yeah, which I guess you see today now with like modern guns and a lot of the shipping companies. Sometimes you run up against issues.
Oh yeah, you pretty much only have like one or two companies.
Yeah,
that are
so
willing.
many times in Cody, I just had to drive.
Oh yeah.
Like we would display at SHOT Show in Vegas in January. We'd always bring guns, and I would have to drive to Vegas with the guns.
Yep.
I would always have one other person so that we could be with the guns at all time. And one time, though, we drove back and we got into a snowstorm and we almost died. And I was like, well, that's all of us. That's it. That was the museum. It was nice while it lasted.
Oh, man. Yeah, I feel like we could go down just a huge rabbit hole with that historical versus modern weapon systems. So, like, I don't know if there's, any additional, like, before we get to another topic, is there anything else that you want to touch on for that right now?
Sure. Just the one technology that you guys probably encounter a lot, that most people would encounter a lot initially when they're looking at firearms would be the semi-automatic function. Obviously, it's incredibly popular now. And semi-automatic basically just means that every time you press the trigger, you fire one round and the gun, basically reloads to be prepared for the next one, which is not to be confused with automatic, which is the gun fires continuously until you either release the trigger, you run out of ammo, which happens most of the time, or the gun malfunctions. So semi-automatics are the most popular nowadays. And I just think it's interesting because I don't think a lot of people realize that semi-automatic technology dates to the 1880s. And so the earliest semi-autos were developed by a guy named Mannlicher in the 1880s, and they were used initially in rifles, but pistols started, semi-automatic pistols became popular by the turn of the 1890s, and you get a bunch of really weird-looking semi-autos, and then they become more standardized right at the turn of the 20th century. But I think just a lot of people don't realize that technology is, really old, and then you add on the fact that firearms that are made before 1898. There are some kind of exceptions. So machine guns are always a machine gun. There's something to do with like certain firearms that have like readily accessible ammo. But basically, firearms that are not machine guns that are made before 1898 are not firearms. They're antiques. And so you actually do have some semi-automatics that are considered not legally firearms federally.
Right.
Which is kind of funny.
So
but
that's the other thing. Like that's a whole other topic. That that's so many episodes down the road. Like we have no desire, right now to go down what that all means. But but that's a really cool point that what the definition of a firearm is versus, like you said, it's
something
very
that's so old that it's an antique.
Right. Yeah, that's really neat.
Yeah.
So what was your first collectible firearm or part of your collection?
So I don't collect as much as people probably would think I collect because I mean, I've spent my whole career in collections and people pay me to be there versus me pay to have those. But I started collecting guns. I always used to joke, I collect guns that I can afford, which I think is really important because you don't necessarily know what's going to be collectible tomorrow. So like I know people that have collected like old really cheap guns and now they're worth a lot of money because there just aren't a lot around. So like so people are like, oh, you have to collect World War I guns or you have to collect Winchesters or whatever, but no, collect what you want and collect it what you can afford because you never know. I mean, those things could be worth something someday, but most collectors really just sell guns to buy more guns, so it's not necessarily like everyone's investing in a future there. But so I collected things I could afford. And let me think. The first gun I had was a Springfield rifled musket that my mom's friend found in a wall. This is like the craziest. I found in a wall. Like, this, how did you get your start? Found in a wall and they kept it and they took it apart at one point and they couldn't get it back together. And when he told my mom this, I was an intern at a museum in Pennsylvania called the Soldiers and Sailors Museum. It's in Pittsburgh. And that museum had a lot of like quote unquote spare parts that weren't collections items. So you could actually utilize them. And so I asked the curator at the time, I was like, hey, can you help me put this thing back together? Now, trust me, it was not getting put back together in any way that was functional whatsoever. We used Gorilla Glue. It was not pretty. Well, I mean, it was all I could do. It's not I was hurting the value of it. It's probably worth like nothing. But I helped put it back together. And I sourced pieces that weren't original but were at least period correct. Put it back together for the guy, and then he said I could keep it. So that was my first. I think that was my first firearm I owned. That's cool. And then I actually bought items that were deaccessioned off of collections. So
what's that mean?
It means it's been through a procedure to be deaccessioned from a museum collection. Okay. But you can't have anything to do with the there's a lot of rules for it, but this is a smaller museum. But yes, I have like a flintlock pistol that has mother of pearl engraving in it. And then I have a Sharps pepper box pistol. So people associate, usually they hear the name Sharps, they think of the single shot rifles, the big Buffalo rifles. But Christian Sharps did randomly make some 4-barrel pistols. They weren't great, but they're pretty cool looking. So I have one of those.
That's neat.
But yeah, so but then, I just work with so many guns, it just didn't really appeal to me. So I actually ended up collecting firearms advertisements, more modern firearms advertisements, because when I was in grad school, I wanted to, we took classes and they weren't necessarily super into me studying guns. So they were like, get creative. So, 1960s and 70s advertisements is kind of where I started collecting things. And that's what I've continued to collect. Rather than just the guns themselves. I mean, I have guns for sure. My husband, I would say, is probably more of a collector than I am.
Gotcha.
Just because I get to see whatever I want for free.
So, so that's a fun little transition. So the stuff that you have, like you said, you had the Smithsonian. There's what did you say, like 7,000 pieces in the museum, right? Then you have the Cody. Then you have other museums that you've been affiliated with. So what do you think, like some of the top pieces, artifacts that you've been able to, whether look at or have some fun shooting or anything, like just. So
that's super subjective.
Well, yeah,
I've said super a lot. I'll try to work on that. That's really subjective. Because and my opinion on what I think is cool changes at all times, or like I just get bored with answering the question, so I just start making stuff up. But I mean, there's the categories, right, of like your gun that's known by a historical figure, and so one of the ones that I've thought was one of the coolest list was anything that belongs to Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia.
Yeah.
Obsessed with her.
Okay.
She's fascinating. Just like, I mean, if you're not familiar with her, I mean, she was a Prussian that was sent over to Russia, and she basically overthrew her husband within like 6 months of taking power, and like turned the military and the people against him, and then he died. Quote unquote. He died under mysterious causes, but she was incredibly respected, especially in a time that was not very respectful of women. And she was a shooter. So
That's really
yeah, she
interesting.
loved guns. So the Smithsonian, we had multiple of her hunting rifles. So that was really cool. And then Cody had a blunderbuss, which is an old shotgun that has a widened muzzle, so the end of the barrel. That's really engraved. And she gave that to, I always get the Louis mixed up, but King Louis the 15th, we'll say, of France, whatever time frame lines
You'll
up
probably
with
have
that.
some like some fact checker on our
Yeah,
well,
whatever.
actually
Whatever. But yeah, so I always thought like historical figures are really interesting. And then there's the firsts. People like the first. So patent models. I'm actually really into patent prototypes. The Smithsonian has the U.S. Patent Office collection. So like I've held the volcanic pistol. The Smith and Wesson becomes a lever action. Sorry, I start talking nerd
No,
stuff.
it's okay. Yeah,
But so like I've held things that like John Moses Browning. I've worked a lot with Browning stuff, but like the original patent of the first Browning patent
that's
and
really
stuff
cool.
like that. And so you get those special firsts that people really really like, but those are very expensive. So
Yeah.
most people, well, most of those things I feel like end up at museums,
Sure,
not
sure.
necessarily in private hands. And then another personal favorite are failures. I love a good failure. So designs that are really ahead of their time, but just didn't work out. Mm-hmm. And that goes actually to patent models a lot, because in 1836, they standardized the patent process.
Okay.
And that was the same year that Sam Colt took out his revolver patents, one in February and one in April. And because of that, now he had the legal right to make that kind of gun. So everybody had to make something different. And so you had some people who made things that were, something you'd recognize. But then you had other people making really crazy stuff to get around patent infringement. And so like there's like the Jocelyn chain revolver, and it's literally like a chain where you put ammo into it, and it like you move it around. It's not it was
weird.
not a good gun. But failures, a lot of people really like failures because it tells you kind of what people's thought process was at the time. But then outside of kind of those special individual things, and people really, there's different categories of collecting. So you get people who are really into like a manufacturer or a model, like Winchester Model 70 collectors or Winchester lever action collectors. And the people that collected gun company specific collections, I think were more like, I think those collectors popped up in like the late 19th century, because that's also ultimately where you get a lot of the industrialization and mass manufacturing of firearms. But then you get the people that just like a specific time frame or a specific war. That's a terrible thing to say. They like a specific war. They're into it. But you get people, so there's like kind of these niches all around, and it's really hard to categorize what people like. But
Sure.
I don't know. I like failures, famous people,
Yep.
and firsts, I guess, are kind
That's
of my, actually one really cool one that I do talk about a lot that is in Battlefield 1, I think. The only one is in
The video game?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I peaked at Nintendo 64, so
Yep,
I
just
had to
making
like
sure,
I
yeah.
hesitated because
Yeah.
I don't know these things. But there's a gun in the Cody Museum. It's the only one that ever existed, and it's and I'm gonna say these words, and I might get in trouble for it. You can bleep it out if you want, but it's an assault rifle.
No, we'll keep it in there. Yeah, it's all good. It's
I
okay.
will define it if
Yeah.
I need to.
Sure,
it was
sure.
an assault rifle that predated the Sturmgewehr, which is the first quote unquote successful assault rifle by decades. It was developed in 1917 or 1918 by Winchester. That's what I love about Winchester. They are not just a Western manufacturer. By Winchester, it is a selective fire, so meaning it can go between between automatic and semi-automatic. It's got detachable magazines, 2 of them on the top. It's got an intermediate cartridge, which I can explain what that is if you if you guys need to. This isn't a great description, but it's kind of an in-betweener. That's
Sure.
what
Sure. Yeah.
of a caliber. And it's single user portable. So there is a definition for assault rifle in the internationally.
So we'll have you define assault
Yeah.
rifle, number 1, and then number 2, what was it? Intermediate. What was it?
Intermediate cartridge.
Cartridge. Yeah.
Oh,
Intermediate
you're
cartridge.
gonna.
Yep.
I'm not. My husband's sitting in the room and he's like an ammo expert, so I'm not even gonna come close to explaining what it is.
He's giving you
accurately.
the evil
He
eyes.
just laughed. He's like, "Don't even attempt it. You're gonna sound like an idiot."
Okay, so because obviously assault rifle is such a a polarizing term right now, right?
So yeah, people get really mad about this term, and I defend it. And I defend it as a historian because it is a historical term. So I tell people you don't have to like the term, you don't have to use it, but that doesn't make it cease to exist. And so the term assault rifle means it's selective fire. It has an intermediate cartridge, which again, my only way I'm going to define it is somewhere between a pistol and rifle caliber. He gave me a thumbs up. I know it's far more nuanced than that. Single user portable. So something that you can actually kind of carry around and has a detachable magazine. There's a couple of other things, but what the reason why people get so mad about it is because people mess up the term assault rifle with assault weapon, which is a legislative term describing features on certain semi-automatics that are not assault rifles.
So it's funny because Tim, Marvin, and I we would love to in the future have you on to talk specifically of like your testimony in front of Congress and all that. So that's a whole other episode. Yep. So but yeah, so we'll focus on like just the definitions. And
so I just opened up a can of worms.
It's a whole other thing.
But it is one of those things, and you see that a lot, like silencer suppressor. The original term versus the term we use today.
Yep.
But you can't make it cease to exist. But the gun that I was describing was basically all of those things in 1917.
Gotcha. So I want to jump over to Tim because I'm sure he is chomping at the bit to try to jump in here for part of the conversation.
I was going to say though, the one thing that really stuck out in my mind is you say your video games peaked at Nintendo 64, and that was actually, one of the onuses of my first start of the collection was actually GoldenEye, trying to put together some of the guns from GoldenEye. So, to that point, my very first gun was a PPK. I had to have the PP7. So,
that's way cooler. I did Mario Kart, Mario Party, and Wave Racer.
Fair enough, but yeah, I know Jim and I can still nerd out over GoldenEye. So
the KF7 Soviet and the Dostavi and everything.
So that's actually its own category of collector nowadays.
Go for it.
Which is the video game, the gamer.
Yep.
And people don't really realize that like gamers know more about guns than most people.
Well, you're in a COD lobby and you got people talking. Oh, I put this on my loadout, and it's like, you actually are using real terms. I don't know if you know that you are, but you actually
you
are.
Want to get schooled by an 8-year-old
right.
like that knows about guns.
Right.
But it's become a new kind of breed of collector. People who like video games that have disposable income that want to have the guns that they see in the game. And that's I think people kind of roll their eyes. It's also the Reddit community, Redditors and guns. Like again, you want to be schooled by an 8-year-old. Like that. But that is a new age collector. When you hear collector, you almost think old as well. You think old guns, old people, old white guys, and it's not that way. And there's a huge wave of, newer collectors. And that is kind of a way that people are coming into being interested in firearms, especially the really niche parts of firearms, models, variants, that kind of thing.
Well, to that point, you're talking about how a lot of us think of firearms collecting as, hey, I'm going to get a Revolutionary War long rifle, or I'm going to get, a Luger, or I'm going to get, some World War II weapon. But there's been this recent resurgence in, Black Hawk Down and, the, oh my gosh, what is his name?
Vickers?
Larry Vickers. like a lot of the Larry Vickers era weapons are right now like all the rage. I mean, you look on YouTube right now, and there are a lot of these big YouTubers are shooting guns that have their M16A2s or M16A1s, or their something that has people are looking for like aim points from like 1997, right? It's insane right now how some of this stuff is coming back, and I was just to the point of me going back to my first deployment in Iraq, and I'm looking at some of the flashlights that we used, and can I get one of those? And people are paying $300 or $400 for those like Surefire lights, and I'm like,
Why?
Why? You can buy a light. It's a 60 lumen flashlight. You don't need to buy. Why is this so expensive? So it's insane right now how like these more recent conflicts and more recent periods in time are actually driving actually more collecting than older eras.
So what's interesting about that too, because you're right. I mean, people are collecting more and more modern things. It's almost like they go, so it used to be for a long time. I'm in a bunch of collectors groups. Like nobody respected World War II collectors, and now World War II collectors are cool. And now people are starting to respect, collectors of like 60s and 70s stuff. But there is a great limitation on what you can collect once we start getting out of the 80s. I don't know if people realize, I always hear people say you can't own a machine gun. Well, yes, you can. You can own a machine gun made before 1986 that's registered. There's no way to register one that's unregistered, and that's a different conversation. Call an attorney.
We are not giving legal advice.
We are not giving legal advice. But now that, the Hughes Amendment, which was essentially a civilian machine gun ban in 1986, basically stopped civilians from being able to own machine guns made after that time. And that I always would say in the museum, that might not sound like that long ago, but we're no longer able to collect multiple conflicts worth of stuff. And if we don't fix that in 100 years, we'll have lost so much important history. And this isn't just individual collectors. It's also, museums can't have it either. But you do see also there's a popularity in semi-automatic versions of, the military guns, not just AR-15s, but, FN has a, huge line of military collector guns. Because like, if you're a collector that wants something that maybe you carried on the battlefield and you want to have something that's more recent, you can't have that. But there are companies that see that is a market, and so they're making as historically accurate as possible semi-automatic versions of it. But it's a big limitation on people who are collecting today. We're just going to lose that history because you can't own it.
Yeah, and it's a shame because people are very, like, whether you call it people, legislators, whoever, protesters, everything. Right? They're so ingrained in the current state. They don't think of the future. They don't think of, well, like you said, 100 years down the road, what are we going to be missing? And it's a shame.
Yeah, people don't see the value in it.
Right.
Although I do always say, the letting museums collect these things should be nonpartisan or bipartisan, because if you love guns, you want to see them preserved, put them in a museum. If you hate guns, get them off the street, put them in a museum. It's just people don't know that that's a thing. I've had meetings on the Hill before, and I'll be talking to a Democrat, politician or their staffer or whatever, and they're supporting, one of the conversation was universal background checks. But, I was like, did you know that museums, have to adhere to all gun laws? And they just don't know. And they don't necessarily have a negative attitude towards it. It's just people have no idea that there are limitations. But I feel like there's a lot less stigma of a museum having it versus, the individual. And I think to some extent, people would hope that technology doesn't continue to improve because it's just, more efficient ways to take out a target in some respects. And so people probably don't want that technology to evolve. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world. And as we throw out our technology, 100 years from now, we're going to have to figure it out again. And that's just unfortunate.
So I guess from there, my question is, you've been around all of these collections. You've had to care for antique firearms. You've had to care for firearms of all different conditions. So what would you say would be some of the watch outs for collectors in terms of caring for it? Say, hey, I got a Tommy gun, or I got something that's a bit older, something from World War II or even World War I. How, from your professional experience, what are some of the things that people can do to make sure that whether they want to fire them or not, ensure that piece is preserved for the future?
So there's kind of a step back from that, which I don't think we've mentioned, so I'll just mention it. But when you're getting into collecting, there's a lot of fakes and frauds out there. So researching what you want, and we could talk about that more in depth, but that is something that people have to be mindful of. But in terms of preservation, there's different levels of from preservation to conservation to reproducing or the word just escaped me. But it depends on what you want. If you want to shoot it, then obviously there's going to be a set standard that you're going to want the collection to be, your item to be in. And I'm not a gunsmith, so I have no idea what that is. But some of the very basic things that museums use to conserve their objects, and I'm talking more about wood and metal guns, not so much plastic. But the very basic things that we use ethanol, denatured alcohol. You put it on a Q-tip and then you dab the Q-tip. That's how little you want on the metal. And you can use that to take off, surface rust. But if you have surface rust, you might have deeper rust issues, so you should, if you can take your gun apart, do that. But what we do, you can take off surface rust, you can take off I always say guck, it's a really official term. And then for stocks, you actually use spit. Our organic chemistry trained conservators, they use spit because whatever's in spit breaks down compounds, and so they use it for a lot. You don't spit on the gun, let me make that very clear. You put a Q-tip, right? Sure. Your saliva Q-tip, you can use it for DNA, you can use it to clean your gun.
Now your DNA's on the gun.
Yeah, now your DNA's on the gun. So they use that, it's spit on a Q-tip, and you use that to kind of take off any type of just little issue on the gun, and then you coat it in a very thin layer of microcrystalline wax. And a lot of people use Renaissance wax. But the one thing that conservators will tell you is always be careful of name brand products, because like a lot of times you'll see something that'll say acid-free paper. That's an archival term, is acid-free. But when you actually read the fine print, it doesn't mean that it can say like 80% or might degrade after this amount of time. And so, and I know with certain there's certain standards when it comes to wax or whatever, where the recipes might not be the same for every batch, but Renaissance wax is what all the museums use. But you have to be kind of careful. There's archival terms, museum terms have become marketing terms. You get that with everything, right? So you have to really kind of look into, read it to make sure. So that's kind of how we basic clean guns. Some other things that people don't realize: collectors don't usually wear gloves. It's not the end of the world with wooden stocks, obviously. I always tell people, if you're not going to wear gloves, don't touch the metal. This is interesting because you'll get a lot of gun guys that'll be like, I don't wear gloves, I just wipe it down. Well, fun fact, if you're holding metal with your oils on your hands and you get that on and then you wipe it down, what did you just do?
You spread it.
You spread it all over the gun. And so yes, you can do that, but it's not a perfect world. So if you want to wear gloves around your collection, it's your collection, do what you want with it. But if you are really concerned about that, I recommend nitrile gloves. Sorry. Not white cotton gloves. I also have a big issue with that. Other than the fact that you look like Mickey Mouse. You'll always see everyone wants to hold.
It's like the Antiques Roadshow kind of stuff.
Yeah. Everybody wants to hold a gun and get the photo with a super important gun with white gloves, which is fine. Whatever. But when it comes to actual maintenance and preservation and care for your object, nitrile gloves are a lot better. Don't get powder in them, obviously. Yeah. But when you have cotton, you don't have as good. You're tactile. Yeah. Yep. And so, you can lift up inlay and not even realize it can get snagged. Mm-hmm. Also, if you're working on your gun and you're wearing gloves, you can sweat through your gloves. Now, nitrile, fortunately and unfortunately, just keeps that sweat inside. So a lot of people don't want that. But I use nitrile for everything. I do not use white gloves unless someone is very emphatic that a donor wants to hold it with white gloves. Because it's better than nothing, right? Mm-hmm. But if you were going to choose to wear gloves, I would say nitrile, because you can work a lot better on your guns that way. But really, it's what you want. Mm-hmm. One of the bigger areas where you'll see care and maintenance being very different. I guess I'm getting ahead of myself, but when it comes to the gun that you have, some collectors want it to be a complete piece. So okay, maybe it's missing the ramrod, the rod that helps load an older gun. I want a ramrod in there. So then you go and find a ramrod. Well, that's not the original piece. It makes it very difficult when you're collecting, because a lot of times collectors want the complete piece. Mm-hmm. So they find something period correct, and then they're not logging it. Museums do, but they're not logging that not all the parts are original to the gun. So then you have to be someone that is able to identify that, and you sometimes can't,
Sure.
So you get that type of collector that wants the, whole thing, and that's fine too. But then you get people that want to keep it exactly as is. And that was where where I was about to say one of the things you'll see more drastically in terms of preservation in the quote unquote gun sphere would be like leather holsters. If you're using a leather holster, you dress the leather holster. You want to keep it supple. Museums don't want to keep the leather supple, so they actually let the holsters dry out. Because when you dress leather, when you use whatever it is you use, I actually don't know. I've never dressed leather. But when it creates what's called a fatty white bloom. So like you'll see on leather, it'll start to be this like crystallize, and museums are always wiping that off. They're always taking that off. But what we end up doing in the museum world is putting like an acid-free tissue to line it, so because it'll start to crack, obviously, and kind of keep it that way. So that's a big difference that you'll see with like a collector wants it to look nice versus looking like where it's at and then having it not degrade over time, not decay over time. But those are kind of the big things. And then it just gets really nuanced. Conservators, like I thought I wanted to be a conservator, but conservators have to go through like all kinds of chemistry, OChem. So that was not in my future. That was not where I was going with things, but it's incredibly complex. But collectors, it's just a different standard. It's what you want. But I would say don't touch the metal with your fingers. There are ways, though, to determine how much acidity is in your hands. Gosh, I said that and now I don't know. I think it's copper. I think if you put your fingerprints on copper and then you wrap them in tin foil. I did this in grad school, so we're talking like 2012. We did it in a museum. I want to say it's that, and you put your fingerprints down and then you wrap it, and then you can see how much of your fingerprint you can see, like as it gets worse, as it erodes. Okay. So like I don't have, my hands are really sticky a lot, but they actually don't have, they don't tear down metal like other people's in the classes hands.
So what you're saying is you're allowed to touch metal on guns.
You didn't hear the part where I said sticky. Maybe at least I just wash my hands. But no, I would not do that. I actually, I've worked with a collection that will remain nameless where we did not wear gloves when we should wear gloves. It wasn't Cody. Okay, I will say that. Cody, we're very strict about that. But it's a big collection that should have been wearing gloves, and they did not wear gloves. Oh, and the collection was, part of the collection came out to Cody, and our conservator was like, there are fingerprints everywhere, and you just don't notice it until it's like too late.
Oh gosh.
Collection to remain nameless. But if you look at my resume, you could probably figure it out.
Got it. Yep.
Just all not good. Cody.
So you did touch on something about the fakes, and you did talk about, hey, when some collectors go out, they just looking for period correct pieces to bring into their collection to make a piece whole. I guess, can we dive a little bit deeper into that in terms of, from a collection perspective, from a museum perspective, what implications does that have in terms of, hey, I'm looking for a ramrod, or I'm looking for this piece, and I'm just getting something that's not original? How does that impact, value or potential perception? And then, from your experience, fakes and other pieces that have been, excluded by museums, how can you, you walk through our listeners in terms of how they can understand what might be a fake, and how museums do it, and they can apply some of those concepts and techniques?
Well, I can't tell you if your gun is a fake. I'm good, but I'm not that good through the podcast. Okay, so it's really hard, and you're never gonna like fully know. The first thing everybody always says, if you want to get into gun collecting, the first thing you should collect is books. But there's difficulties there because there's no, and I mentioned this earlier in the episode about this kind of collectors versus historians thing, and they don't necessarily get along.
Sounds like this is going to tie into that.
I didn't even intend that. So you get these really good books on like specific types of guns, the guns of World War I, or just like the Model 1805 Harper's Ferry, and you'll get a whole book about that, and it's usually written by the collector for the collector, and it's incredibly detailed and lots of images. And then you get historians friends who write more contextual histories, but they also tend to know nothing about guns, like the actual guns themselves. And so you get a peer-reviewed academic work that is riddled with gun inaccuracies. But
Tell me about your thoughts on that.
I think that has to do with testimony. I think that's another episode. But what happens though with the collector's books is there are amazing books out there, but there's no vetting process. So like if you're new, how do you know that this book that's self-published by some schmo is a good book? And I don't have the answer for you.
Sure. Yeah.
I don't quite have an answer for you. But that is where it gets really difficult because we enter into realms that people in my profession lovingly called FUD lore. So there's a lot of gun guys that love guns, and they don't know as much as they think they do about them. And so FUD lore, is this gun belong to this person? How do you know that? Because like my Meemaw knows. And it's very, very difficult. And I want to say, I'm sure it's like this with everything. I don't know. Maybe it's like that with chocolate. I don't know. But like guns, I feel like it's really, really difficult because there's so much misinformation that's been promoted and regurgitated by like influencers and people, that you think like, I hate to say it, but like old white guys, like when they start talking about gun history, I feel like people look at them like, yes, you know everything. Like, oh, great one. And they do. A lot of them do. But they almost get like a blanket, like, you're like this, so I'm going to assume you know what you're talking about. And that's, we encounter people wrong all the time. And a lot of times people are wrong and I just nod. I don't actually try to correct them because they don't want to be corrected. So all of that was a long way of saying, I can't help you. No. So books. But it's kind of like you need to meet people in the field. Honestly, I hate to say this, but Reddit is like really great. Like they've got some really good stuff on there. Like if you're younger, I would go to the subreddits on guns and see. I've pulled information off of Reddit. Now, granted, you get your information and then you need to like confirm it like 2 or 3 times.
Like, is there FUD lore on Reddit? Of
course.
course,
of course. So but I don't know why people seem to like track and cite things a lot more than I would expect. Like if you're trying to learn a basic history about this, and every historian on the planet's going to hate me, Wikipedia is a great place to start. Don't end on Wikipedia.
Right.
Confirm Wikipedia. But like if you're just trying to get a sense of like, well, this looks cool. What is this? Wikipedia is a great place to start. But you kind of like need to start. There's discussion boards and things to learn about the books. But start with getting books that have been around for a long time, or that Amazon's nice because you can read reviews. Gun books are very expensive. Can be very expensive. But that's kind of where you start. And then it's honestly a process to learn. Like, so if you're going to collect one specific model, then you might get really good at spotting like fakes, because you'll get to know the markings and you'll get to know, the exact configurations that it was made in. But some really simple things to look for would be like, okay, so say you've got I'm going to continue to use wooden steel because it's just the easiest one to talk about, because those are what most people are collecting. Although you can collect polymer guns too, that's cool. My husband does. But yeah, so like if you've got like a piece of metal and you've got like wood around it and it doesn't fit perfectly, like there's like little tiny gaps, there's a chance that something's been replaced on that. Like if you have a flintlock, like an old Revolutionary War pistol, you'll have this side plate that's called a lock plate on one side and a side plate on the other. And it's metal and it hugs up against the stock, which is wood. And you'll see a lot of times those locks have been changed. And you'll see that it no longer fits perfectly around the metal. That might be. Now, metal or wood does warp over time depending on the condition, but you'll see things like that. Screws on like an early revolver. You can see if the screws they're not the same. You can tend to notice those types of things. So something just doesn't seem like it fits together, like a perfect piece. That's when you can start looking at that. Now, that's like your basic simplest thing, but then you can get more into I get really into markings, and now I know what the markings are, and this marking is not accurate, and you can get into roll stamping, the stamps on the, well, that's not what, Colt stamped on its barrels in this year. But I think you kind of start with, I could go on forever. You start with books, you go on Reddit. I think
Then
I might
Wikipedia.
then Wikipedia. No, you start with Wikipedia, then you go to books because they cite books on Wikipedia. There's actually really great resources in the footnotes of Wikipedia. I'm probably going to get so much hate mail for that. But there is, I use it all the time because you can actually go to real books and then those books are usually pretty good, and then you can go from there. But just, don't assume everything you're hearing because someone speaks with authority, including me, knows what they're talking about. And so a museum, you asked about a museum. Museums are really bad about this for a really long time. Like when I was at Cody, I rebuilt Cody. We gutted it and redid it. And we would finally go through provenance, what it's called, your background paperwork that supports the history of the gun. And I saw something that we said was something for decades. And the only piece of provenance that actually existed was an affidavit from a dude saying that it was what it was. I'm because people never lie on legal documents.
Oh, wow.
So what museums try to do is they do try to get as much direct evidence that a firearm was used at a place. Just because a family member says it, I saw it when I was younger, doesn't mean they actually did see it when they were younger. Cody actually had Zane Grey, the novelist's Winchester Model 1895, and I guess at one point his son or grandson came to the museum, maybe his grandson, I don't know much about Zane Grey. I was not there for this, but they had this whole thing to celebrate the relative of Zane Grey being there, and he walks up in front of all the cameras and he goes, "That's not my dad's gun."
No way.
But it was his gun. He just didn't remember it right.
Oh,
no. So when you hear things like the family said it, or a friend of a friend, you gotta you're buying the story, right? You're buying that. If it convinces you, great, but it doesn't mean it'll convince everybody else. And you'll see that when you read provenance on auction sites, be very, very careful because it'll be a lot of finger pointing, in this person and then this, but then you'll realize there's no actual direct evidence to anything. So museums kind of were investigators, true crime detectives on a lot of that. But you'll never get it perfect. That is one thing. Very rare, well, not never. Very rarely will you get something that's point blank goes from here to there to there to there, and you have documents each and every way. A lot of people like to try to get a gun in a photo to be look, it's there, but that's not great. I don't think I instilled a lot of confidence in anyone in everything that just came out of my mouth.
No, but
it's terrible.
So
you'll never win.
But you have to do your due diligence.
That's not Billy the Kid's gun that I have in my collection right now.
I mean,
That's
I don't know.
not
I don't know your paperwork.
But it's just a lot of due diligence you got to do.
No, I think that's a great tip. I mean, like I said, the Polytech that I had the original bill of sale. I had all of the original paperwork, right? It was a 40-year-old firearm, right?
Yeah.
And so all of it came from Kang's out in Atlanta, and it's you have the original receipt for how much it was sold for, stamped paid, and the original whatever they had, and then the manuals that they sold with those guns at the time. It was pretty incredible, and a lot of people were when I was putting it up for sale, a lot of people were like, "Oh my gosh, you actually have all of this," and it's really proof that this is actually this firearm from this time period, and then obviously all the accessories that people, oh, is it a chrome line follower on that magazine and all of that other fun stuff. And so I think that's a great tip for people who are looking to get into collecting. And the more paperwork that you have, the sure that you can be that it is what they're representing it to be, the better you are, especially if you're whatever. We all say, hey, I'm buying this gun because it's an investment, right? But
but are
That's
you?
just what we tell the wives.
So it's really, it's read the fine print, and don't just assume because someone has a great story that they're telling the truth. Don't assume auction houses. Auction houses, they say everything that they need to say. it's your job to read the fine print. I mean, some I'm sure intentionally mislead, but like, I mean, I went through a binder of provenance. There was someone handed me a binder of provenance for an auction house to look at, and not one piece in that binder actually tied anything to it.
You're kidding.
It was a lot of hearsay and affidavits.
Oh, wow.
I don't know when people were like, let's go, this affidavit means it's true. But so like read the fine print is one of the biggest ones. I'll use this as an example because it's been published, so I'm not sharing something that is not accurate, but like one good example is the shot heard around the world gun. I don't know if you've heard of it. They're nodding. You guys can't see that, but they're nodding. It was a gun that was sold by an auction house years ago, and it would claim to be the gun that was fired, the shot heard around the world. Yep. Went for a lot of money. And my friends who are with Antiques Roadshow into an article because they know that type of Dutch musket, and they said not possible. It wasn't imported into the U.S. until after the war.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Now, it did belong, if I remember correctly, because I didn't, like, they were talking about it. It did belong to the same guy that fired the shot, but that gun wasn't imported into the U.S. At that point in time. I want to say it wasn't there till, like, the 1790s.
Okay.
And so, like, I mean, that's a high-profile... You know, and I don't know what the provenance on that gun was. I mean, the auction house is great. I didn't think the auction house did anything wrong in it. But that's the other thing that gets it so crazy is that, like, you have to find someone who's such a nerd, because I think it came down to, like, barrel bands on the musket. Like, who thinks I know a lot about guns, and I wouldn't, notice that. So, you know, a lot of times people aren't even trying to misrepresent what they have. They just, unless you randomly know that, niche piece. But then there are times that I've read things, where you'll read the provenance and you'll be like, nope, that actually tied nothing. It sounded great, but it didn't actually say anything. So that's a big, read the fine print on everything you buy and read between the lines. Read between the lines. We like words like allegedly, reported to have been.
Oh, boy.
All the museum words might have been in the presence of,
Any way to get around the actual... Like, yes, this is it.
Allegedly.
Yeah, and once you get that gun in your hands, you can really start doing your research into the markings and all that other stuff. For me, like I come back to like World War II, mostly Garands. And once you get into the Grand world, it gets really nerdy. People are looking to make sure that, we can trace the serial number on the receiver, but then, okay, that's a December 1941 receiver. Well, that bolt dates from 1943, right? So that's not an original bolt. So, yeah, some of those things, they can go really down a rabbit hole. Thankfully, a lot of the military stuff, or at least of more recent, has markings, especially that they were made by multiple manufacturers. But just being able to trace things back and go through the markings and really try to see where a gun's been is also a really cool thing, especially with like arsenal refurbishments that I have on my old CMP 1911, seeing that it went through one of the arsenals to be refurbished sometime in the 70s. The one good thing I will say about the military for sure is, Jim and I, we've made FOIA requests on some of our surplus guns, and unfortunately, the only thing I was able to find out is my 1911 lived in Alabama and got transferred a few times within Anniston, Alabama, for about 30 years until it got sold to the CMP and sold to me. So, I can't take it back to all the way back when that receiver was made and introduced to the military in 1918. Now that I think about it, it's a Colt frame, so I could probably reach out to Colt, who's actually very good at that as well. So.
Yeah, they're really good. They have a separate, I think it's a nonprofit that does all the letters, so you might be able to get something on that. And you're going to screw up. I mean, I think I've now officially scared everyone into not ever buying a gun. You're going to screw up. I would just recommend, if you're going to make $1 million screw up, maybe you hire a bunch of people that know what they're looking at before you do that. But yeah, I mean, you're going to buy things. And to some people, who cares, right? Like, you just want it, you want to look at it. You can't afford, a complete original gun, So it all comes down to that statement that I've said way too many times today. It's really what you want it to be. be. I know for a fact that lock plate on my flintlock, pistol is not original. I don't care. Thought it was cool looking. That was it. It was all my thought process. Thought it was cool.
Yeah, and that's half the battle sometimes. I know for me, I actually specifically go out of my way looking for guns that aren't necessarily historically relevant. Trying to track down a West German P226, without the box and papers, so I can get something that doesn't have any collector's value, because I want to shoot all my collection, right? So the one thing I will say is, they don't see nearly as much use as, my more modern pistols. But, being able to get out, shoot a West German 226 from time to time, get to shoot my World War II 1911 from time to time. It's nice to put those things through their paces, but at the end of the day, I'm still trying to baby them a little bit, but I'm not looking for something that really has immense collector's value. And where it really comes in handy is, especially with new shooters or people who are like, hey, I'd love to try a gun like that. I'm like, as a matter of fact, I've got that. So let's go shoot it. Let's go try it out and, help other people get into shooting, whether they come from a history background or something else. Hey, let's go shoot a Garand. Let's give it a try.
Well, and that's something that I think is so unique and special about firearms and firearms history is that it is such a hands-on type of history. You can read how a flintlock fires all day long, but unless you fire one, it doesn't really quite come into focus. And being able to be like, okay, so I'm firing this musket and I had a bunch of people coming at me and these are all the steps that I had to take. It's a really powerful thing to be able to fire, not if not the originals, the replicas, like more structurally sound replicas. So it's very special to have something that somebody can go out and shoot because you are shooting a piece of history or you're shooting, it might not be actually historic, but you're shooting to understand what people were going through back then. And I think that's very special. I also really very much advocate that if you're going to study firearms history that you need to shoot. I don't care if you want to shoot every day. I don't shoot every day. I've really messed up hands, but but you should at least try to shoot what you're talking about, so if you're going to talk about flintlocks, you're going to study flintlocks, shoot a flintlock, understand, cause I can read it and I can tell it to you, but until you really shoot it, you don't quite, you can be like, well, when there's a delay between, the time you press the trigger and when the bullet comes out of the barrel, but I can say that, and sure, I kind of know what I mean, but you really need to shoot it. And so it's something very, very special and about collectible guns is you can actually do something with it that I feel like lets you tap into a bit of the past. I'm sure most academic historians wouldn't agree with that because you're bringing your present mind to a historical artifact. But I think it's really special, and I think it's a cool part of this type of collecting because you're not just looking at it, you're not just touching it, but you can actually, operate it in some state. And if you want to operate it, go to a gunsmith or go to somebody that knows. Do not just operate it.
Yeah, make sure that it's
that's
sound.
my advice.
Yeah.
Do not listen to me. If you want to shoot it, go take it to somebody that knows if it's even able to be shot.
Yeah, but that's also a good thing that you bring up is reproductions, right? Especially for things like flintlocks and things like that. Being rather than shooting a 200-year-old gun that has been stored in a questionable way for 200 years, being able to go get a Pertisoli reproduction for a couple $100, it's going to give you the same feel. It's going to most likely be more reliable. It's definitely going to be safer. So reproductions are also a good thing. Looking at some of these
reproductions are great.
Yeah, especially if you're going to be shooting them and not just hanging them on a wall. Just looking at 1911s, if you want something that's a feel of a, World War I, World War II, 1911. You don't have to go, track down a surplus gun, on the used market for, 1,500 or more. There's some quality Turkish manufacturers out there that they're making, a decent clone for, a couple $100. So I think if you're just looking for the feel and the experience of a gun, it doesn't necessarily have to be an original, but reproductions are definitely a good option if that's what you're looking for.
You think about it, reproductions are almost historic now too, early reproductions, because they started becoming really popular. more modern concept, like Western firearms, and that being popular in the 1950s, 1960s. And so that's even historical now, if you think about it. But there are still, obviously, I mean, you can buy ones made yesterday. But I love reproductions. I think they're great. And you're right. There is a more stringent requirement because most of them are imported on how they operate and how they fire. And the companies, I mean, Pedersoli, Pieta, Muberti, like they've all been around for a while. You know, I've been to Granfo Trompia, where they make them. I mean, Pedersoli still has like old ladies hand carving, you know, the muskets. So like there are things they'll make in assembly, and then there are things that they will, you know, do themselves, and it's really pretty special. And you know, not to get back into legal stuff, but if it's a modern reproduction of a flintlock, it's not a firearm; it's an antique
because it's replicating something that wasn't. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Fun fact.
That's fun.
I mean, don't walk it into New Jersey and try to make an argument for it. But actually, this is a true story at SHOT Show, shooting, hunting, outdoor trade show. For anyone that doesn't know, it's this big industry trade show, and like I mentioned earlier, we would always take these firearms in, and you can't take guns through the casino. My husband's like, when he said, theoretically, you're not supposed to take guns through the casino. It used to be, it was very stringent when I had the year I had it. And so I'm walking through the Venetian with these Pelican cases. So, of course, you know what it is. And security.
It's totally a camera.
And security stops me. And they go, ma'am, is that a firearm? I said, well, I mean, not technically. And he was like, what? And I was like, what? I don't remember. I think you were there with me for that. You had to go get the car or something. It didn't pass. It didn't pass. It did that did not. I was like,
so did you start giving like a history lecture?
I think I did. I did. I was like, well, you know, it's me before this doesn't want to work. I would not argue with anybody about that, but technically,
you're right. I mean,
yeah. My lever action that was made before 1898. Yes, not a firearm.
So long story short, check with your local laws. As the New Jersey resident here, I do have to say, unfortunately, some states do not agree.
Yeah, I think Massachusetts is like that too. I think. Which,
funny enough, that's where a lot of those guns came from. So yes,
federal law is different than state law.
Yeah,
federal law is different than state law. Thank you for pointing that out.
Oh man, that's funny. Can you talk to us a little bit about your TV show that you have had, something like that? Because it's really cool. You know, we were talking about it a little earlier.
Did you watch it?
From what you were saying.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, okay. So people really liked the show. I've done a lot of television. My first TV gig, I think, was on Tom Gresham's Gun Talk, which is a radio show, but it's also a television show on the Whisper Channel. The Whisper Channel. That's what they call hunting channels, the Whisper Channel. And so I've been doing TV as long as I've been doing this. For those of you who are listening, might not know this, but I am a woman. I'm not young anymore, but I was back then. I'm 35 now, so that's not bad. But you know, when you're not what people expect you to be, you end up being asked to be on camera a lot more, which I honestly did not. I grew up doing like theater, but I really didn't want anything to do with that when I was studying guns. I wanted to like be locked in a vault with guns and like never talk to anyone because I'm actually very like privately shy. I'm just really good at faking it. So I started doing television, and so I've done a ton. Like I've done a lot for Nat Geo. I was on Mysteries of the Museum like way too many times, being a quote unquote expert in things I knew nothing about. Yeah, you just don't always trust us if we're on TV. But I did have a show on Discovery Channel for one season. It was called Master of Arms. It was a weapons making show. It was meant to be the competitor to Forged in Fire. That didn't go well because it didn't last more than a season, but it was a cool concept. It was instead of just making knives and edged weapons, you were making longbows, crossbows, and guns. It had all the like ingredients to be a really good show. And trust me, people really liked the show. I'm super critical of myself, so that's partly why I laugh because I also don't like the way they edited me. I think the producers the network made some questionable choices in what they wanted the show to look like. And I was a judge and a co-host, and there were three of us. And the questionable decision that I have there, and I know that they did make this, they thought only one of us could be like funny or personable. So they edited it out, and they picked the wrong person. Oh God, I hope he doesn't listen to is. I'm not gonna say who it is, but if you know the show, you know. They picked, in my opinion, they picked the wrong person. I'm not saying I'm hilarious, but I think that they needed, it wasn't the right person to hold that humor for the whole series. He was a funny guy. He just wasn't the right person. So we had all this great banter that they just cut out. And they asked me to, I would do voiceover, the history, like a 30-second history, like, not Catherine the Great. Who's the one that burned alive? We had an episode about her.
Joan of Arc.
Joan of Arc. We did a Joan of Arc episode, so I would read these things when people are off camera, and I would do the history like in front of the contestants. Like I would talk about stuff. They never used any of that. They only used the voiceover. And so it sounded like, and I'm a hard sell. Like back then, like I was a bleach blonde. I was 29. I'm looking at my husband because I filmed it the year we got married. I was 29. I was 28. And so I looked like I was reading a script. What people didn't know is I wrote the script, So like I had someone, on Twitter say that I had absolutely no personality. And I was like, that has never been said about me once in my life. There can be lots of things said about me, but boring is not normally one of them. So it just kind of was one of those things. It was a great show, had amazing contestants. Our contestants were awesome. And they're still like really well known in their fields. And we had a great time. It just seemed like the edit didn't line up. And so it seemed a little corny. It seemed a little forced. So it just ultimately didn't click with the network for another season, but which is fine. It was the only time I've done a show where I also didn't have any say behind the scenes. I was specifically talent. And people really like networks are really nice to talent, but they don't necessarily take you seriously. Our executive producer, our showrunner did. That's why I was able to write all the stuff that I was saying. It sounded like I was reading, but so I was able to do that, but I didn't have any of that kind of say on the back end. So there were things in editing, like I was there in New York. I just happened to be there the day they were editing something, and I was like, "Why is the lock plate on that side?" Because they had flipped the image, and they don't know those kinds of things. So, but yeah, it was good to some extent. I loved it. I had a great time. The one thing about TV is like it's really great for your ego because when you're someone like who studies something, TV is so basic that like I'll come out and be like, a flintlock musket was used in the 1700s, and everyone's like, "Oh my God, you're so smart!" So it's a real good ego boost. But it was great, and so I'm on a show called Gun Stories with Joe Mantegna. It's on Outdoor Channel, which whispers but also speaks normally sometimes. And so it's a great show. They do a different gun every episode. I've been on it for seven or 8 seasons. I'm what's called expert, not talent. That's the way of saying we don't need to pay you.
Okay.
But you do sit down interviews and, you film the whole season in one sitting.
Wow.
Yeah, like it's like I'll sit there for like 2 hours and I'll talk about the different guns. I talk about guns in almost every episode because I'm the only woman they've ever had on the show.
Oh my
but
gosh.
it's an awesome show. And Joe Mantegna is the best from Criminal Minds.
Oh, yeah,
He's the best. So I still do it a lot. I've learned a lot from that. And now I kind of require that I have some type of production role in production.
And it's pretty agreeable, I'm sure.
Yeah. I'm not looking to be like, I know how this should be edited, and cut. I'm looking to go, why'd you reverse that? Why'd you slice that together? When you slice that together, now it's completely inaccurate. That's what I'm there for. I'm not like, and then you should move the camera this way. I did an interview with Ted Koppel years ago.
Oh my gosh.
And he was great. He was really good, very good interviewer, very scary. And he was wonderful. But
was that about, what was it surrounding?
Well, we were told it was 2 different things.
Uh-huh.
So it was right after Ted had moved to a different network. I can't remember if it was CBS or if he moved to ABC, because he'd been on one network for his whole career. And they were doing an episode on guns in America. And I had been working with the production side of things on the history section. And then at the last minute, Ted's friends with a guy in Wyoming, and Cody, who's a board member of the museum. And he was like, well, why don't you come out and do something about like gun culture, like in a place like Cody? So he came out to do gun culture in Cody, and I thought I was still being interviewed about history. And I was in the museum, and it was like my first, like, I want to say, I guess, big girl interview, because I actually, like, I knew who he was, but I didn't, like, know. And so he, like, asked me off camera. He's like, oh, how'd you get into guns? And I was like, well, I wanted to be a doctor. And he's like, oh, that's really interesting. And then we get on camera, and he asked me the same question, and he cuts me off, and he goes, so you went from wanting to save lives to things that take them.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I started sweating for 2 hours. So we were like doing this back and forth like the whole time. And he asked me these political questions, and I don't do politics. I've absolutely never said anything public about how I feel about something. That is not my job. My job is to give you context. You get to make those decisions. And so we're back and forth, and it's a mess, right? Because I can't answer anything. I'm standing in the museum. I would lose my job. And I can't answer any of these questions. But then he would also, like, when we were doing, like, B-roll, which is when they're just getting, like, shots of you walking or whatever, and there's no sound or whatever. But I still had a microphone on. And he would say things like, well, okay, now that we're not, like, doing the interview, like, what do you really think? And that kind of thing. And I was like, I am still attached to a microphone, so I don't have an opinion. And then we gathered everything up and put away all the mics, and I said something where I basically answered the question, and he's like, so you did know the answer? And I was like, yeah, I wasn't gonna say it though. I was like, not my job. And so he actually ended up apologizing to me like 2 days later at the shooting range, because and then he told me, you're not going to be in the interview because I can't use any of the footage we used because you didn't give me anything. Because he needed me to say something political, which at the time I thought my world had ended. Like I have a picture with Ted, and like you can see behind my sunglasses, I'm crying because I thought I messed up. And then I realized that was the best compliment I could ever be given, because it means he didn't get me, saying something that I needed to say. But he apologized because he's like, it's my understanding now that we were told we were doing 2 totally different interviews.
So is that when you found out that you were doing 2 totally different things?
Afterwards.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I started to figure, because in my head while we were doing, I'm like, why is he asking me about the politicization of the firearm and when that happened in history? Like we're in a museum with artifacts. Like I'm not a political historian. And so, it was kind of one of those moments where I was like, I don't understand why he's doing this. But yeah, he apologized, and he's like, it came to my attention that he's like, I really did not know why that you had been talking to another segment producer about something else, and that you were totally blindsided.
Oh, wow. So so you took him to the shooting range. So
he was filming the 4-H kids.
Oh, okay.
So I was just at the shooting range because the parents asked that I be there because they were nervous about having a journalist, talking to their kids and stuff. So I was just there for moral support and to have my hopes and dreams of being interviewed by Ten Koppel live on TV.
So that was your first foray into doing interviews, I think you said.
Oh,
right?
no. I'd done interviews. It was my first foray into being, like, interrogated to someone that interrogates terrorists. Like, it was my first time actually, like, everyone pretty much lobbed softballs at me before that because I was a museum curator. But that was my first time I'd been asked really intense questions, and I've gotten better at it over the years. So thanks, Ted.
Touching just a little bit onto the testimony in front of Congress. So, like, where does that fall in the line of, intensity versus...
that was fun. Very intense. So, I'm trying to not go into another 2 hours worth of dialogue. But, so basically I testified in May of 2021 in front of the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on, it was called Stop Gun Violence, Ghost Guns. And so I was asked to write a statement on the history of privately made firearms in American culture. And then an ATF draft ruling came out the Friday before. And so I also spoke to they were redefining what a firearm legally was and stuff with serialization and all that. So I also read through the rule. I think I was the only one that probably read through the rule before the testimony. And it was crazy because I was called... I got a call from someone at Senator Cruz's office in Texas at lunch on Thursday, and my report was due Monday. I agreed to do it on Friday. They confirmed that they wanted me to do it on Friday. I flew to DC on Sunday, and then it was due Monday because I was testifying on Tuesday, and my person told me that it was due Monday evening, and then they were like, JK, it's due at 10 a.m.
Oh my gosh.
And I wrote a 25-page report. You didn't have to, but I did. And then I testified, and that was really fascinating because that's different. I do expert witness work, and this is different. You get 5 minutes, and they have a little box, and it does count down, and you are not allowed to go over your 5 minutes. And I wrote it out because I don't know if you guys noticed, but I tend to ramble, so I was a little worried that I would go off on a tangent, and then my 5 minutes were over. And so I wrote it, but then, of course, I looked up, and I never knew where my place was, so I just riffed. And a bunch of the senators on the committee, they do their little statements first, and they had read my report, or their people had read my report, so they kind of stole some of my stuff, so which is, I guess, great. But then, so you speak for 5 minutes, and everyone else speaks for 5 minutes, and everyone's got differing opinions. I think I might have been the only person that like was a gun person. I know, is he the governor now? Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
He was one of the people testifying that day. And so you get your 5 minutes, and then you can only speak when you are spoken to. And I was told that, really only the Republicans were going to ask me questions. People who were like, quote unquote, on your side were going to ask you questions, because why would you give the time and the platform to someone you don't agree with?
Right.
And nobody was there. Like Senator Cruz left, somebody else left, and it was only Senator Lee was the only one that was there. And he kept asking me questions that I didn't want to answer. He actually was like the worst at asking me questions, because I was like, why are you asking me that? That doesn't, that's irrelevant. But for some reason, I think it's because everybody left. And so it was middle of COVID, and or it was a year after COVID, but it was still, everyone was like, fist bumping. Yeah, bumping elbow. I did get bumped elbows by Senator Blumenthal. It was pretty cool. But for some reason, he just decided that he was gonna allow another round of questions.
Okay.
And he decided that was dedicated to me. And we had a great back and forth. He actually thanked me afterwards. He was a really good sport about it, because I did actually make him look kind of dumb.
Which one, Blumenthal or
Blumenthal.
Shapiro? Oh, okay.
Blumenthal. No, Shapiro and I didn't. He was nice enough. We talked beforehand.
Okay.
But he didn't talk to me afterwards. But you don't speak until you're spoken to. So you kind of write notes so that the second somebody asks you a question, you answer. You say all the things you wanted to say before you answer their question.
Yeah.
So that was actually, it was obviously stressful because I'd never done anything like that, but it wasn't terrible. I also think I was just naive back then. I didn't know how scary it could get, how personal it could get. And that's where I did all the expert witness testimony on the Second Amendment cases since the Bruin decision in 2022. I'm mostly retired from it because it got really, really personal. I was getting threatening phone calls.
Wow. Holy cow.
Yeah, it's not great. They couldn't find a problem in what I was saying. They had to find a problem with me, and I'm just not the right personality type for that. You know, I already like let me depose myself. Like I can get you a lot more dirt because I promise you my thoughts about myself are much worse. So that's where that got really intense because on these cases you would have multiple attorneys, which is not normally the case, but since the Supreme Court decision in 22, it's gotten really ugly. So there were attorneys assigned to me to dig into everything I've ever said.
Oh my
and
gosh.
So it was just like for hours you would just sit there and wait to see what they pulled up, some quote from you from like 5 years ago. And that got really, really stressful. The history part never stressed me out, but the attacks on who you were as a person got really exhausting. I actually had a federal judge say that I was not credible. The most important reason I was not a credible witness was because of whom I was married to.
Really?
Because Mark works in the gun industry, that I couldn't possibly have a thought in my own head.
Sounds counterintuitive, but
yeah. It was a woman that was a female judge too. I think that all the judges around the country that have been like waiting for like a woman to be able to say it because no man could have said it, in writing. So that was intense. That was really rough. I hope it gets better because I think it's caused the historical field to kind of be a mess because now it's not about respectfully disagreeing and getting better scholarship out of it. It's about tearing the other person down and saying, I don't not agree. It's not that I don't agree with you. It's that you're wrong. And that because I believe you're wrong, I believe then you're manipulating history to get what you want. And both sides do it to each other. And that's just caused it to be gross. But that, again, like I said, that's probably a whole nother episode because that is a really fascinating thing that's happened to the historical field since the Supreme Court decided in 2022 that the most important way to determine constitutionality of a modern firearms law is by finding a historical precedent. From the founding era is the first one, so the 1790s. So the law didn't exist in some form, doesn't have to be the exact same wording, but if it didn't exist in some form and the technology was there, then you can argue that the modern gun law is not constitutional because it's not based on the way the founders would have defined it when they ratified it in 1791.
Oh, that's going to be such
That
a fun
is a
episode.
whole
I'm
thing.
super excited for that.
That is a whole thing.
Yeah. Marvin and Tim, thoughts, questions?
I just wanted to go back to the show that you had on the Whisper Channel. I didn't catch the name of it, so I was like, "Hey, what is the name of that show?"
I didn't. Master of Arms. I think you can still see it on Discovery. I know you can buy it on Prime. I don't. Some people love the show. It's not a bad show. I just don't like watching myself on camera. It's just it could have been better. But yeah, Master of Arms.
Was that the one that was with Joe Montana?
No, that's Gun Stories with Joe Montana. That's
Gun
an Outdoor
Stories.
Channel, and that is still
okay.
around. I'm about to film. I don't know, season 1 million in January.
That show's been on forever, Marvin. I'm surprised you haven't seen every episode.
And I have a different hair color in every season.
You do that on purpose?
No, I don't like to. I had blue hair last season.
Oh my God.
And I lost my voice because it was on Thursday of SHOT Show.
Oh, geez, you've been talking for days
Yeah,
already.
it's going to be Thursday of SHOT Show this year, so I'm going to have to figure out something.
So do you have your own booth kind of set up then at SHOT Show?
No, I'm a floater.
Okay.
I've got like 2 or 3 clients that are going to be there. University of Wyoming, the Firearms Research Center that I founded will be there. Los Angeles Police Museum's a client of mine will be there. I'm forgetting somebody. But so basically I just go and bop around and represent the different groups I work for in meetings, whether they're development for fundraising or content. And then I do media there. I don't do as much as I used to, but I think this year I'm going to be doing more. So like I used to like have a microphone hooked up to me and Outdoor Life would follow me like all day, or like Recoil would follow me like all day. And then I got less cool and they stopped doing that. But I think this year I'm supposed to be doing more of that.
Okay.
I think I just got kind of like, I get busy and it's just a lot to try to squeeze in interviews and stuff. But I need to be better about promoting my clients. So.
Tim, do you got other any comments on either the shows or any of the testimony stuff?
No, all I have to say is I'm just sitting here absolutely awestruck on the things that you've accomplished in both the very visible things with your TV shows, but some of the more behind the scenes stuff, and I just have to say that you're a great ambassador for really the truth and the history, and that's one of the things I love about history is, to your point, it's, if you're doing it right, it's apolitical, right? The history is history, and I've just have a lot of respect for somebody who just gets up there and tells the truth all the time. So thank you for that.
At least you think I'm telling the truth.
Well, you say it with so much confidence that you must be telling the truth.
I'm exactly the person I told you to watch out for when they say it with confidence.
Yeah, so I think we're getting close to wrapping up this episode. Ashley, do you want to give a Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, any of those links that people can follow you at? Yeah,
so if you're interested more in the firearms history or the firearms law stuff, I did co-found a research center at the University of Wyoming, and there's a lot of historical information on there, a lot of basic information on there, and that's firearmsresearchcenter.org. And then if you just want to see like my dogs and some random history stuff, I'm at History and Heels on Instagram, and I'm at official Ashley Hlebinsky. Have fun spelling that on Facebook. I do have a Twitter, but it's only because I don't want someone to take my name, so I don't really use it. But yeah, I mean, just follow me. Instagram's the thing I'm most active on, but I'm gonna be honest, I'm kind of lame now, and I get bored, and I don't want to post things. But yeah, firearmsresearchcenter.org, and I do have a website called theguncode.com. If you are interested in like any of my consulting, you can contact me on there.
Awesome. And then any upcoming projects that you have, so you that you're allowed to talk about, I guess.
Yeah.
So
I've got the research center in Wyoming, and we are it's really taken off. I'm also in the process with a friend of mine, a colleague of mine. We're creating the Center for the Study of Arms History in the UK, which is going to be a more material culture based focus, so more artifact focused arms history, anything from stone tools to guided missiles.
What? And that's cool.
Yeah, so we're just basically getting money to place fellows around the country in different institutions, and then aggregating current scholarships. So I've got that. I'm working with the LA Police Museum. If you're ever in Highland Park, I don't know why it would be, but near Pasadena. Great museum, crazy artifacts. We're working on making it more of a museum and less a repository of crap. But really good stuff. That was family friendly enough? Right?
That's
okay.
fine. Yeah.
Okay.
You're good.
Los Angeles Police Museum. I just opened an exhibition up at the C.M. Russell Art Museum and Complex in Great Falls, Montana. I worked with the Matthew Browning side of the family for about a decade, and it's the Matthew Browning Jr. collection. So there are a lot of prototypes. John Moses and Matthew's dad, Jonathan, was a gun designer. They actually have some of the repeating firearms that he made. So if you're in Great Falls, Montana, it's in an art museum, which is super random, but I just opened that exhibit, which is really cool.
Very cool.
I'm working on a couple of like museums inside gun ranges, but
Okay.
TBD on that.
Got it. Tim, that's the thing that I was going to come to you earlier on, is the Browning stuff, because I know you have a love for Browning. So anything you want to say?
No, I just can't wait to see a little bit more about that. All I know is I definitely now have to add Montana to the list. I know Cody's been on the list for a while. I got to go see that Glock collection. I got to rub that in Jim's face a little bit, because I believe that's what the only factory Glock 26 compensated one or ported.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, so I got to be the Glock nerd for Jim.
Craziest
So.
Glock collection. Oh, I love Glocks. Sorry, everybody else. I like other people too. My husband works for SIG, but I do like a Glock.
Oh, that's funny. Marvin, any questions, comments, concerns, anything?
No, just really thank you for your time, and I will make sure to put all of the links to all of your stuff in the description of the episode, so that people don't have to try and guess how to spell your last name.
That's really kind of you.
So, Ashley, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a wonderful time talking. Definitely looking forward to other episodes if you're willing to chat about, the testimony piece of being in front of Congress, and just the activism of what you've been able to accomplish there, and who you might have been able to work with on that legislative piece. If I don't know if there is or isn't, to be perfectly honest, but this has been such a fun conversation on the historical piece and museums, and just learning a lot about stuff that I didn't know. So it's wonderful. And Tim, thanks for joining us on your first episode here. Marvin, it's always a pleasure.